In the small town of Gatlin, Nebraska, a boy preacher named Isaac leads the children in a cult worshipping He Who Walks Behind the Rows. They murder all adults to ensure a bountiful corn harvest. It's like a murderous daycare run amok. Bert and Vicky, a young couple, drive through Nebraska and accidentally hit a boy. They discover his throat was slit. In Gatlin, they find the town deserted and eerie. Isaac's enforcer, Malachi, captures Vicky, while Bert discovers the truth. Isaac orders Vicky to be crucified. Bert fights off the children and rescues her. Isaac is sacrificed by Malachi, but returns possessed by the entity. Chaos ensues as Bert, Vicky, and two local kids, Job and Sarah, burn the cornfield, destroying He Who Walks Behind the Rows. The entity bites the dust. They escape, but not before a final scare from a surviving child. Cue the eerie cornfields swaying in the wind. Tom had lived in Laurel, Maryland, his whole life, and nothing strange had ever happened. But one chilly night, while sitting in his favorite chair, he noticed a faint, glowing figure at the edge of his living room. At first he froze, thinking it might be his imagination, but as it got closer, the figure became clearer, a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, smiling warmly. "Don't be afraid," she said softly. "I've been watching over this house for centuries." Tom blinked. "You've... what?" The ghostly figure chuckled. "I was the original owner. I like what you've done with the place." Instead of fear, Tom felt a strange comfort. They spent the evening talking about the house's history and shared stories. As dawn broke, she began to fade. "I'll see you again, Tom. Same time tomorrow." Tom grinned. "Can't wait." Tom found out ghosts weren't so scary. They made for great company. In the fall of 1971, strange sightings began near Bowie, Maryland. Local teens, Charlie Harris, Harper Whitman, and a few friends were the first to report it. They had been hiking near Governor Bridge Road when they heard strange, bleating sounds echo through the trees. Harper saw it first, a creature, hunched over, half man, half goat, just beyond the old Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. They ran, but Charlie swore it followed them. Locals dismissed it as a prank until November 14th, when police responded to a call. A car had been found near Fletchertown Road, doors ripped off and the ground scattered with hoof prints. The car belonged to Tony Montalvo, who's never been found. To this day, some claim the goatman still roams those woods, waiting for anyone foolish enough to come too close to the old research center. After dark. Deep in the dark streets of Mexico, there's a tale that warns travelers to beware the night. El Cadejo, a supernatural dog, roams the roads. They say there are two Cadejos, one white and one black. The white Cadejo protects those who've lost their way, guiding them to safety. But the black Cadejo, it follows the wicked, feeding off their fear. Its glowing red eyes pierce the darkness, and its footsteps are silent. No matter how fast you run, it's always one step behind, its breath chilling the air. Some say, if you hear it growl, you won't live to see the morning. And if you look back, it's already too late. The Harrison family moves into a quaint colonial house in Old Town Alexandria, ignoring their realtor's warning that the home was built in what was once an ancient burial site. Everything seemed perfect until that first night, the youngest daughter, Emily, hears whispers from the walls, but her parents dismiss it as nerves. Just after midnight, the house shudders violently and cold air sweeps through. The whispers grow louder, echoing Emily's name. Panicked, the Harrisons try to flee, but the front door slams shut. A deep voice mutters from the shadows, "You've disturbed our rest." In an instant, the house falls silent. The Harrisons escape to the yard, only to find their realtor watching from his car. "I warned you," he says, before driving off, leaving the family frozen in fear, realizing they've awakened something ancient. Tommy was just a few weeks into his new job as a pizza delivery guy when the order came in, a large pepperoni, extra cheese, to be delivered to an old church on the edge of town. His co-workers went pale. "That's the old St. Mark's," one of them whispered. "No one goes there after dark because of the legend." The story was that anyone who delivered food to that church never came back, but Tommy laughed it off. "It's just an old building," he said, grabbing the pizza and heading out. The night was foggy, the kind that swallowed the moonlight whole. As Tommy approached the crumbling church, he saw a flicker of light from within. Someone must be in there, he thought, convincing himself it was just a prank. He knocked on the massive wooden door. It creaked open on its own. Tommy hesitated but stepped inside. The air was cold, and the only sound was the echo of his footsteps on the stone floor. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. He placed the pizza on the altar, deciding to leave before the chills got any worse. Just as he turned, he heard a voice, soft and raspy. "Stay for the feast." Terrified, he bolted towards the door, but it slammed shut. Panicking, Tommy pounded on it, desperate to escape. Then the lights flickered on, and his co-workers burst out laughing from behind the altar, holding up cameras. "Gotcha!" they yelled. Relief flooded Tommy as he laughed with them. But just as they were about to leave, the door wouldn't budge. They tried everything, but it was like it was sealed shut from the outside. Suddenly, the church bells rang, loud and ominous. The laughter died. Tommy's eyes widened as he whispered, "But who locked the door?" The flickering lights went out, leaving them in pitch-black darkness, and from the shadows, the real voice whispered again, "Stay for the feast." The door slowly creaked open, revealing only the empty, foggy night outside. Thank you for listening to Caesar's Journal. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more thrilling tales. Late one night, Sam Lewis III nervously dialed 911. He was sure of it. His neighbors were aliens. The strange lights, the eerie hums, something wasn't right. The popo arrived quickly, and Sam hurried to explain his suspicions. But before he could finish, the officer smiled. "You're right, Sam. They are aliens." Sam froze. "What?" The officer's smile widened. "In fact, so are we. The whole town is." Panic gripped Sam as the officer pulled out a small device. "Don't worry, this won't hurt." A flash of light, and suddenly Sam felt calm. The officer patted his shoulder. "Just another quiet night in our little town." And from that day on, Sam lived peacefully, never questioning the oddities around him again. Detective Langston crouched in a dark alley, the faint glow of his cigarette the only light in the gloom. He bent down, finding a strange symbol etched into the pavement. Just then, a rustling sound broke the silence. His eyes shot toward the trash cans. A kid, no older than 10, was crouched there, wide-eyed and trembling. "Easy, kid," Langston said, pulling out a card. "Here's my number. If you remember anything, call me." The next day, the boy hesitated at the police station doors before walking in. "Detective Langston, where is he?" The officer behind the desk froze, eyes narrowing. "Langston, you sure about that?" The boy handed over the card, smudged with rain. The officer's face paled. "Kid, that's impossible. Detective Langston passed 20 years ago, right in that alley. He was working on this case." The boy's heart raced as he realized the detective's card still felt warm in his hand. In the heart of Washington, D.C., Congressman Bosco Peterman worked late, finishing a bill meant to cement his legacy. The office was silent, save for the ticking of a clock. Suddenly the clock stopped. He looked up, and the room darkened. The air turned icy as a shadowy figure emerged from the walls, whispering, "Your time is up, Bosco." Terrified, he tried to flee, but the door wouldn't budge. The shadow advanced, eyes glowing with malice. "You made a deal long ago. Now it's time to pay." The figure lunged, and he screamed only to realize he was in his bed. He was relieved it was just a dream. But as he turned on the light, the same whisper echoed in his ear, "Your time is up," and his heart stopped. A clock read 3 a.m., just like the one in his office. The next morning, news broke. The congressman had passed away in his sleep. The clock in his office? It was stuck at 3 a.m. Jake and Laura were hiking the Appalachian Trail when an old man suddenly warned them, "Stay off the trail after dark. Once a year, it wakes up. It feeds." Dismissing him as crazy, they continued until dusk, finding shelter in a cave. Inside, they discovered bones, human bones, scattered across the ground. A foul stench filled the air. Then a terrifying growl echoed behind them. They turned to see a monstrous creature, part earth, part nightmare, blocking their exit. They tried to run, but the cave was its nest. The last thing they saw was its maw closing in. The old man returned to the trail later that day, shaking his head sadly as he saw the faint footprints leading to the cave. He sighed, muttering to himself as he tapped his cane against the ground. They never listen, they never learn. And deep within the earth the creature slept, satisfied for another year. Frank had worked the night shift at the abandoned warehouse for years, mopping floors and keeping an eye out for vandals. One night, while sweeping near the loading dock, he noticed something unusual. A faint, bluish light emanating from the shadows. Curiosity got the best of him. He approached, squinting into the darkness. The light pulsed, drawing him closer. Suddenly, the floor beneath his feet shifted, almost like a heartbeat, and then an eye opened in the concrete, bloodshot and glaring. Frozen in fear, Frank watched as the ground beneath him began to ripple. The walls seemed to breathe, exhaling cold, damp air. The warehouse was alive, but not in the way he'd ever imagined. He ran, heart pounding, never looking back. As he reached the exit, the lights flickered off and the pulsing stopped. The warehouse fell silent, lifeless once more. Frank quit the next day, swearing never to speak of what he saw. On a lonely southern road, a traveler found a forgotten town. The sun cast long shadows over the dusty streets. Silence, not a sound, not a soul. Empty windows stared back, waiting. Curiosity pulled him deeper into the heart of the town. He passed a diner with chairs neatly stacked, an old church with its doors wide open, and a gas station where the pumps had long run dry. But there was no life, only the unsettling stillness. As he walked, unease grew. A soft voice whispered his name. He spun around, nothing. He quickened his pace, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. He reached the town's edge and sighed in relief, but as he turned to leave, the road ahead led back into the town. Glancing behind, more town. His heart sank. He was already home, and home was nowhere. Cosmopolitano, a middle-aged man from Brooklyn, lay in bed, trying to sleep in his old apartment. Tonight, though, the usual city hum was replaced by an unsettling scratching noise from the corner of his room. He turned on the lamp, but saw nothing. With a sigh, he dismissed it as the building's quirks and lay back down. The scratching returned, louder and more desperate. Cosmo followed the sound to his closet. Hesitating, he opened the door and found a pair of pale, cold hands emerging from the darkness, holding a dusty letter. Trembling, Cosmo took it and read the faint words. "We've been waiting." The hands vanished, and the closet door shut on its own. Just as Cosmo caught his breath, it started again, this time from beneath his bed. Frozen in fear, Cosmo heard a whisper, "We're not done yet." Something cold brushed against his leg, and then nothing. Poppy Pimples, the dedicated librarian from Northern Virginia, was used to the late nights, but tonight the flickering lights and eerie silence seemed more sinister than usual. As she organized the dusty shelves, she noticed a shadow moving in the corner of her eye. She reached for the heavy, leather-bound book she kept as a weapon. Not that she had any practice, but she figured knowledge could really pack a punch. The shadow morphed into a menacing figure. Suddenly the figure lunged at her. She screamed, swinging the book, only to find herself hitting nothing. Poppy blinked, looking around. The shadow was gone. The source of the horror lay on the floor, a book titled How to Scare Yourself Silly. Poppy chuckled. "Poppy Pimples, you've done it again," she muttered. "Scared by your own shadow. Again." She picked up the book, straightened her glasses, and with a smirk continued her work, this time with the lights fully on. In Brandywine, Maryland, Mr. Grimes was known for his peculiar habits. Every night, he'd step onto his front porch at midnight, holding a lantern. He'd light it and stare into the darkness, murmuring, "They're watching." The townsfolk dismissed him as eccentric, until one night, a young woman named Clara, curious, decided to watch from a distance. Midnight struck, and as Mr. Grimes lit his lantern, Clara felt a cold shiver. The wind stilled and the air thickened. Suddenly the lantern's light flickered, revealing shadowy figures all around the old man, silent, watching with glowing eyes. Panicked, Clara backed away, but she bumped into something solid. She turned to find herself staring into the glowing eyes of another figure. The lantern flickered out, leaving only their eyes visible in the pitch black. The next morning, the townsfolk found Clara standing on her porch at midnight, holding a lantern, whispering, "They're watching." In Charles County, a farmer named Ned lived alone in the woods. One night he heard rustling in the bushes. He turned, expecting a deer, but what emerged was something far more unsettling, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. He had read tales of the woodsman, a creature said to haunt these woods, stealing the souls of those who crossed its path. The figure loomed closer. With every step, the creature's eyes seemed to burn brighter, and Ned could feel his strength leaving him. Just as the creature reached out, Ned's body tensed, ready to flee, when suddenly the figure spoke in a low, rumbling voice. "You've been overdue on your library books for weeks, Mr. Ned. I'm here to collect." Ned blinked, his terror turning to confusion. The figure handed him a library slip and vanished into the night. As Ned stared at the paper in disbelief, he muttered to himself, "I really need to stop reading those magazines." One rainy night, Jerry Lomez found himself lost on a winding country road. His phone's GPS failed, and the road signs were hard to read. As he drove on, he saw a small, old gas station. Relieved, he pulled in and went inside, hoping to get directions. The station was eerily quiet. The attendant, an old man with a toothy grin, appeared behind the counter. "Lost, are you?" the old man asked. Jerry nodded, explaining his predicament. The old man's grin widened as he pointed down a dark, narrow road. "Take that road. It'll lead you right where you need to go." Jerry thanked him, filled up his tank, and left. He followed the road, but never seemed to end. Hours passed, yet he was still driving. Then in the rearview mirror he saw it. The same gas station, the same old man, the same toothy grin waiting for him. Jerry's heart pounded as he realized he'd never left. The road didn't lead anywhere except back to the beginning. In the heart of Georgetown, Jane received an envelope with no return address. The invitation inside simply read, "Join me tonight for dinner." Thinking it was from her boo, she followed the directions to a grand but crumbling mansion at the edge of town. As she entered, the door creaked shut, and dread filled the air. Flickering candles cast eerie shadows on a hooded figure at the table. "Welcome," it whispered. "I've been waiting for you." The figure revealed its eyes that burned with an unholy fire. "You accepted my invitation, and now you're bound to me." Jane screamed as the figure moved closer. As it was about to touch her, the clock struck midnight. The figure froze, then dissolved into ash. Jane's phone buzzed. It was her boo. "Did you get an invite to some dinner? I ignored it. Seemed sketchy." Jane stared at the screen in horror, realizing the invitation was from something far more sinister. The entity wasn't gone for good. Honeybell Pepper was a typical teenager, always glued to her phone. One rainy night she noticed something odd. Her window, usually silent, began to whisper. At first it was a soft murmur, but soon it was her name, over and over. She crept closer to the window, trying to make out the source of the sound. The glass fogged up and a handprint appeared. Terrified, she backed away, but the whispers grew louder, urging her to look outside. Trembling, she pulled back the curtain. There, reflected in the glass, was her own face, pale, lifeless, eyes wide in horror. The reflection's lips moved, but the voice wasn't hers. "Let me in," it hissed. Suddenly the power went out, and the room plunged into darkness. The whispers stopped. Her phone buzzed with a new notification. She looked down. From Honeybell. Let me in. Welcome to Caesar's Journal, your go-to podcast for thrilling stories and eerie tales. Prepare for tonight's episode, Haunted by the Road. Dr. Ronald Van Nostrand, a man of science and skepticism, found himself driving down Crane Highway late one night, just outside La Plata, Maryland. The locals avoided this road after dark, but Van Nostrand scoffed at their superstitions. As he cruised down the deserted stretch, the fog thickened and eerie shadows seemed to dance along the tree line. The car radio, once playing softly, crackled with static, and a chilling voice broke through, "Turn back." Dr. Van Nostrand shook his head, attributing it to signal interference. The road seemed to twist and turn more than he remembered, leading him deeper into the woods. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the distance, a woman standing on the side of the road, frantically waving. He hesitated, but decided to stop. The woman, pale and shivering, claimed her car had broken down. Despite his better judgment, Dr. Ronald Van Nostrand agreed to give her a lift. As they drove, the air grew colder, and an unsettling silence filled the car. The woman's gaze was fixed straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Van Nostrand attempted conversation, but she remained unresponsive. Finally, with a forced smile, he asked, "Where exactly are you heading to?" The woman slowly turned to him, her eyes empty and cold. "Home," she whispered, "until you pick me up." Her words sent a chill down his spine. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and fell silent, leaving them in eerie stillness. He looked over, and the woman had vanished, leaving the passenger seat empty as if she'd never been there. Dr. Van Nostrand stared ahead at the fog-covered road, but when he glanced into the rearview mirror, his heart skipped a beat. He saw his own reflection, but in the back seat, another figure sat, a shadowy presence, waiting. The truth dawned on him in that instant. The road wasn't just cursed, it claimed those who traveled it, trapping them forever. Now, Dr. Ronald Van Nostrand was part of it, just like the woman before him, bound to haunt the next unlucky traveler who came along. Thank you for listening to this chilling tale. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and stay tuned for more stories that will haunt your nights. Until next time, sweet dreams, if you can sleep. In the heart of Alexandria, Virginia, stood a decaying house, long abandoned but not forgotten. Sarah Marshall felt an inexplicable pull toward it, finally giving in one stormy evening. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the floorboards groaning beneath her steps. Everything seemed oddly familiar, as if she had been there before. She wandered through rooms, her unease growing. A faded photograph on the mantel caught her eye, a woman standing in the doorway bearing an eerie resemblance to herself. Curiosity led her to touch the photo, but her hand passed through the frame. Startled, she turned to the window, seeing a man outside. He pointed to the house, saying, "It's been empty since that woman disappeared." The truth crashed over her. She wasn't exploring an abandoned house. She was its ghost, forever bound to its walls. Tim sat across from his therapist as he recounted his tale. "I know it's crazy, but I swear I was abducted by aliens. They took me to their ship." The therapist, calm and composed, leaned in slightly. "How would you describe the experience?" "It was terrifying. I felt helpless, like they were playing with my mind. But talking about it now, it feels so surreal." The therapist nodded slowly. "And do you think you've fully processed the experience?" Tim blinked, feeling a strange unease wash over him. I'm not sure. It's like I'm stuck in a loop." The therapist smiled. "Perhaps you never left." Tim's breath caught in his throat as the walls of the room shimmered, revealing its metallic surroundings. He wasn't in a therapist's office. He was still on the ship, and the creature before him wasn't there to help him escape his nightmare. It was the nightmare. The last thing he heard was the alien's voice. "Now, let's begin again." In Arlington, Virginia, Frank lived a quiet life until his new neighbor, Mr. Sloan, moved in. Sloan was odd, too tall, too pale, and his eyes seemed odd. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that Sloane was hiding something. Every night, strange noises echoed from Sloane's house, humming, clicking, and a low, vibrating hum. Frank's curiosity grew until one evening he decided to investigate. Peering through the window, Frank saw Sloane in the basement, but nothing strange, just ordinary tools and a workbench. Embarrassed by his paranoia, Frank was about to leave when Sloane appeared behind him and said, "Looking for something?" Frank made an excuse and left. He was wrong, or so he thought. That night, a blinding light engulfed his room. Frozen in fear, he realized he had been right all along. The last thing he saw was Sloane's glowing eyes staring down at him as everything faded to black. Frank was never seen again. Fran Antonio had worked the graveyard shift at the Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. for years, but tonight felt different. The halls were unusually silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. As he made his rounds, Fran heard the faint sound of a child giggling, echoing through the empty corridors. Fran followed the sound to room 304, which had been empty for months. The door creaked open, revealing a little girl in a hospital gown by the window, her eyes wide and hollow. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" Fran asked, stepping closer. The girl pointed to the corner, where Fran saw his old security uniform draped over a chair. Confused, he looked down at his current uniform and saw his reflection in the window, transparent and fading. He was the one lost. Fran had been dead for years, and this was his last round. The little girl smiled, taking his hand, leading him into the darkness where he belonged. In 1945, William Williams III, a seasoned explorer, arrived at a remote village deep in the Brazilian rainforest. He had heard of a local legend, a mysterious entity said to guard the jungle's darkest secrets. The villagers warned him, but William was determined. He ventured into the dense foliage, the jungle's sounds growing quieter with every step. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around him. He came upon an ancient stone altar, covered in strange symbols. As he was examining it, a sudden rustle behind him made his heart race. He turned, but there was nothing there. The silence was deafening. Without warning, the jungle came alive with a cacophony of whispers. The ground beneath him trembled, and the trees seemed to close in. In a moment of sheer terror, William realized the legend was real. His scream was swallowed by the jungle, and he was never seen again. Barbara Smith Flanagan from Waldorf, Maryland, loved her peaceful small-town life. Every evening, she'd take a walk through the nearby woods, feeling safe among the familiar trees. One night, she discovered a crumbling well hidden beneath vines. As she peered into it, a chilling whisper called her name. Barbara. Barbara. Suddenly, a cold hand clamped onto her shoulder, but there was no one there. Trembling, she rushed home, convinced it was just her imagination. Later that night, she heard the same whisper echoing in her bedroom. Frozen with fear, she glanced at the mirror. Instead of her reflection, she saw the well, and a hand reaching out towards her. With a scream, she woke up only to find herself standing in the woods, right by the well. It wasn't a nightmare after all. The whispers surrounded her, pulling her in. As she plunged into the blackness, she realized she never left the woods. She was the whisper all along. In the heart of a forest, there stood a forgotten, abandoned manor. Rumor had it that the manor was cursed, and those who dared enter were never seen again. One evening, a woman named Ilara sought shelter in the manor during a storm. Drawn by curiosity, she entered as the door creaked behind her. Amidst the dust and decay, a silver mirror caught her eye. She approached the mirror, its surface gleaming. She gazed into it, expecting to see her reflection, but instead, it was a reflection of herself, older, wearier, and surrounded by shadows. A voice asked, "Do you wish to see your future?" Without thinking, she said, "Yes." The mirror rippled, showing Ilara endlessly wandering the forest, aging without escape. As panic set in, the reflection's hand broke through the glass, pulling her in. As the storm raged outside, the manor grew silent. In the mirror, Ilara, now wide-eyed and trapped within the glass. Late one night, after the dinner rush had dwindled, Darlene Benez wiped down the last table in Mel's diner. As she headed back to the counter, she noticed something strange. a single plate sitting in the middle of an otherwise empty booth. She was sure she had cleared that table earlier. The plate was spotless, except for a single fork resting on it. She glanced around. There was no one else in the diner. She took a step closer and saw that the fork was bent in a perfect circle, as if someone had twisted it effortlessly. She reached out to pick it up, but as her fingers touched it, a crash echoed from the kitchen. She rushed through the swinging door, only to find everything in perfect order, except the freezer door was now open. As she approached, a faint whisper curled around her ears, though the words were impossible to make out. She fled, not bothering to close the door behind her. Darlene never returned. In the quiet, wooded hills of upstate New York, Jasper Costanza had grown used to the stillness of rural life. But tonight, something felt different. Jasper was out checking his traps when he first noticed it, a faint rustling, not from any direction, but from everywhere at once. Suddenly the rustling stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping like a heartbeat. But it wasn't his. It grew louder, more insistent, as if something massive was lurking just beyond the trees. Jasper's flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. He took a step back, then another, until he was running. He burst into his cabin, slamming the door shut behind him. He pressed his ear to the door, and the thumping stopped, replaced by a whisper murmuring his name. He never opened that door again. His cabin abandoned, his traps left untouched, and no trace of him ever found. Hazel had lived on Solomon's Island, Maryland, for decades. The quaint seaside cottage was her haven. But lately, the stillness of her home was interrupted by strange noises, creaks, and eerie whispers. She dismissed them at first, blaming the old house. But as days turned into weeks, the disturbances grew: footsteps, shadowy figures, cold drafts. Hazel became convinced her home was haunted. Determined, she roamed the halls, calling out to the ghost, "Who are you?" But there was no response. One night, while staring into an old mirror, she saw it. It was a reflection of herself, but older, gaunt, with hollow eyes. She gasped, reaching out, but her hand passed through the glass. In that moment, she remembered the sudden pain in her chest, the light fading as she sat in her favorite chair by the window. She had died weeks ago. The ghost she'd been chasing was herself, bound to her beloved home.